Hi, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Seth Gerson, and I'm Program Director for K-12 Education here at the National Governors Association. Welcome to our conversation today with Andreas Schleicher on global trends in K-12 education, including trends in academic recovery and support, student mental health and well-being, and educator recruitment and retention. Please note that this recording is the latest in a series of 10 other NGA webinars designed to help inform governor and state strategies for addressing K-12 student needs, all of which are available on the NGA K-12 Education webpage. Today, I'm honored to engage in a conversation with Andreas Schleicher, Director for Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. Andreas has worked for more than 20 years with education leaders around the world to improve quality and equity in education. Before joining the OECD, Andreas was Director for Analysis at the International Association for Education Achievement. With that introduction, let's dive into the conversation with Andreas. Andreas, just to start foundationally, please tell us about the OECD, the primary focus of your recent work, and the trends you're seeing within K-12 education globally.
Thanks, first of all, for hosting me. And yes, our work at the OECD really focuses on tracking educational progress globally and then distilling lessons from that for public policy, what we can do to have students learn better, teachers teach better, and school system to work a lot more effectively. Now, you may have heard about our PISA assessments. This is the kind of global NAEP where we look at the knowledge and skills of students. And those are the kinds of measures that we use to track educational progress. But then we add value to those data by through in-depth analysis and policy research. Your question on global trends is perhaps harder to answer. On the one hand, you can see education progressing very differently in different parts of the world. Think of East Asia or Northern Europe, basically racing ahead, rapidly improving education systems, and you see other countries starting to fall behind. And you see some countries closing equity gaps, and then others, those gaps are widening. And you see some countries, delivering great value for money, while in other countries, actually high spending only produces moderate results. So those trends are very hard to distill globally, but education is also facing interesting common challenges these days, and that's perhaps where global trends are more clearly visible. The pandemic has woken up our analog school systems to the digital world, and that is radically transforming learning. And so you can see many countries actually looking at how technology can not just conserve existing practice, but truly transform it. I think that's a clear global trend, accelerated through the pandemic. And then you can see countries, in the wake of, GPT-4 of those systems, countries thinking harder, how do we complement, not substitute the artificial intelligence created in our computers? So there are some global trends, but also really lots of interesting different patterns that make the world a really interesting laboratory for different policies and practices.
Yeah, I really appreciate you providing that introduction, and we'll get into all of those as we sort of move forward in the conversation. But the digital skills, a lot in this country was spent on the devices and connectivity and internet access for connecting students during the pandemic. So as you said, countries, it sounds like, worldwide trying to figure out how do you augment in-person learning now that students are back in school, and really use that technology to harness learning and move it forward. Last year, in that vein, OECD, I know, released 2 reports, Building the Future of Education and Education at a Glance 2022. What were the major findings of these reports in sort of that forward-looking way, like you were saying, of where countries are trying to go post-pandemic in particular, and the implications for you would think, for K-12 education here in the US?
Yeah, the publication Building the Future of Education looks at the frontiers that education faces, demographically, and also in terms of technology, in terms of, pressures on education systems of various kinds. That's a more conceptual piece. And then Education at a Glance puts up lots of empirical data. It really looks at the resources invested in education and then also the kind of economic and social outcomes that are tied to investments in education. And when it comes to resources in education, for example, Education at a Glance shows that the US has a lot of financial means in at its disposal. Now, clearly, at the university level of education, the US leads the world by a large margin when it comes to spending per student, and that creates a lot of possibilities for universities, and also the economic and labor market outcomes of a college degree in the US remain really good. But, the same data set also shows that high spending has its downsides. Now, the financial barriers, tuition for students to go to university in the US have become high, maybe prohibitively high for some students, and that may explain why the share of students going on to university in the US has not grown as fast as it has in other countries over the last years. And actually, the US has fallen quite a bit back in the ranking on that. So resources are also quite good in school education in the US. Also, even though Education at a Glance shows that there's quite a bit of variability among the US states on that. And here the publication raises more questions about the effectiveness of spending choices. Now, on the one hand, spending for every school students is quite high in the US, but on the other hand, teacher pay in the United States is far from competitive, at least when compared with other countries, and also similar jobs with similar qualifications. And then on top of that, teachers have in the US a lot less time for doing other things than teaching, again, compared internationally. And the reason for that is that, a lot of that high level of overall spending doesn't arrive in the classroom. That's sort of a feature where the US is different from a country like Japan, where most of the spending actually is directly related to instruction. And what the US can really learn from some high-performing education systems there is that it's important to prioritize the quality of teachers over things like the size of classes that have got a lot of attention in the US. It's really about improving productivity in education and the instructional core. That's at least where the attention in most high-performing systems has come. That's what Education at a Glance tells us. Another area where probably the US has large scope to improve concerns the earliest years, early childhood education and care. What you can say here is that Education at a Glance shows us massive progress around the world. Basically, a decade before, a minority of 3-year-olds would be in some kind of, organized education, childcare, and education. Today, it's, in the order of 70–80% in most countries, and that's really an area where the US has invested a lot less and is now looking differently. So Education at a Glance really is about looking at what do we invest in education and what are the kind of long-term economic and social returns.
That's really helpful. So really painting the picture of the funding that's available in the US, but how it's spent in comparison to other countries and where you put the prioritization in terms of really thinking about the teachers and the impact that has on the students, and not looking only at the classroom level, but making sure that instruction's there. And like you said, on the college matriculation, being able to get into college and be ready for college, as well as early childhood education on the front end, to make sure that you're looking at all your systems and how they work in tandem, and how to spend those dollars effectively to get the most bang for the buck. In terms of, you mentioned earlier around the PISA report, the Program for International Student Assessment that comes out regularly. I know you also at OECD work on the TALIS report, Teaching and Learning International Surveys every few years. Why are these important for state education leaders, for governors' offices to pay attention to here in the US? What would you say for the last surveys that were given would be the highlights, the key findings, the takeaways from those results for the 2018 surveys, and what do you expect for the upcoming ones in future years?
Yeah, again, with education at a glance, we look at the investment in education with PISA and TALIS. We study the outcomes. At the end of the day, you want to know what students know and what they can do after 10 years of study. And that's exactly what the PISA study does, with a very similar methodology to NAEP. So it's basically an assessment that we run. The difference to NAEP is in the United States, and PISA is done in almost 100 countries now. Basically, it's a very powerful way to compare the outcomes of education on a global scale. So you can actually see how different systems perform. And PISA doesn't just give you an overall assessment of learning outcomes. It also tells you how student performance plays out, against social background or gender or geography. And that also offers really interesting perspectives for policy. How do students from similar social backgrounds end up with different outcomes across systems? One striking feature from an earlier PISA survey here was that the 10% of the most disadvantaged 15-year-olds in the province of Shanghai in China had outcomes that were as good as those of the 10% wealthiest 15-year-olds in the United States. And that really shows us that poverty need not be destiny. There was a country or a system that had massively invested in attracting the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms and providing really every learner with excellent learning, and then delivered on the outcomes. I really think those cross-country comparisons tell policymakers what is possible. They can lower the political cost of action by providing ideas and support of what you can do, and they sometimes increase the political cost of inaction by actually putting more pressure on systems to deliver better value for money. Now, and TALIS, a different survey, looks at all of this through the eyes of teachers. It asks teachers, what makes their job attractive, and again, how that compares across countries. In the face of teacher shortages these days, a really important question. Intuitively, you might think, well, that's all about salaries. But you can see a country like my own, Germany, that pays its teachers really, really well, comes second among OECD countries, and still has struggles, a lot with teacher shortages. And you can take a country like Finland, where teacher salaries are just so not great at all, below the average in the OECD. But you have 10 applicants lining up for every teaching job. And what this tells us that, yes, it's important to make teaching financially attractive, but even more important, to make it intellectually attractive, offering teachers interesting and rewarding careers, creating opportunities for professional collaboration. All those kinds of things are what we learn when we study the world through the eyes of teachers. So you put all of these different perspectives together, the student perspective from PISA, the teacher perspective through TALIS, the system perspective through education at a glance, and suddenly you can see how education functions in different contexts.
That's really helpful context, and particularly where you're talking about the TALIS survey and how it's not just financial incentives, but also the professionalism pieces of having the ability for teachers to grow professionally, and looking at that retention vehicle of not only how you're bringing teachers in, but how you're able to keep them in leadership positions to lead other teachers along the way. It makes me think of to those who may say, well, United States is so different of a system from some of those countries you mentioned. How do you sort of answer that as to, really important to look at and to take some of these pockets of information as snapshots as really being able to import onto the US system?
Yeah, all students are different, classrooms are different, countries are different, but actually what we can use international comparisons for is how those differences actually play out. For example, we can study students from a similar socioeconomic background and look at their performance across countries. We can look at the relative share of students who have an immigrant background and see how they come out. So once you start to slice the data through different lenses and perspectives, you can actually achieve meaningful comparisons, even among systems that on the surface look very different. Now, when you do that actually systematically, and you do that over time, you actually find that much of what we see, to be unsurmountable differences among systems actually, turn out to be minor nuances. I give you an example. On the PISA, assessment, you can statistically account for about 78% of the between-school variation with the data that we measure. It still leaves, a little bit of unexplained variability, but it shows you actually that the factors that drive success internationally are remarkably common. That's one of the lessons that we learn from PISA. If you ask yourself, what makes education systems in different contexts succeed, you always come to very similar kind of findings. It is about setting high aspirations. Most high-performing education systems, wherever they are located on the globe, in whatever context they operate, are very ambitious when they set, student expectations, have, a highly pitched, national standards, curriculum or whatever. They are very good in aligning resources with needs. Some spend a lot, like the US, some spend very little. But what they typically do is they make sure that the resources act where they can make most of a difference. You can see that those systems typically make teaching very attractive. They get really bright people into the teaching profession. They develop them to become effective teachers, and they keep them in the systems, and they give them opportunities to actually redefine and contribute to the system. So once you study actually those factors, you find that what looks different on the surface may not be so different when you actually look at this in terms of policies and practices. And that's why I believe there's a lot that we can learn by looking outward.
A lot more similarities than differences once you dig into the data. That's really helpful. I want to pivot to, we're just emerging out of the pandemic. Governor's office is still grappling with the impacts of that, probably for multiple years for students and staff. I know OECD has done a series of reports, webinars on the impact of COVID on education systems across a range of countries. What would you say were the top lessons learned from how countries responded to the pandemic, and what innovations and promising practices from it would you recommend to build out now that students are back primarily in classrooms? Any countries you'd point to particularly?
Yeah, obviously, this has been an incredibly interesting period for, education evaluation and research and analysis. And on the one hand, you can say that the COVID pandemic has, deeply disrupted learning and caused, huge damage to students, particularly for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. At the same time, it's also been a time of extraordinary, not just technological, but also social innovation in education. I think sort of that is what we will remember from this period. The first lesson, of course, is, that school closures have been extremely damaging, particularly for students at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Now, if you came from a wealthy background, you found many ways around closed school doors. That's the good part, but students from disadvantaged backgrounds really were hit very, very hard. They had very few alternatives. They remained shut out when the school doors closed. So clearly, countries that never closed their schools or closed them only to a very limited extent, now think about Sweden or France in Europe, they had a huge advantage. Countries that had long school closures, and the United States actually belongs to that, at least most states in the US, according to our comparison. You can see sort of a trace of that in national assessments and so on. Second, we saw a lot of variability how rapidly education systems adapted to the new digital world, and particularly how countries use technology not just to conserve, existing practice, but really transform it, to do things differently. Now, you could see artificial intelligence, before nobody talked about it in education, and suddenly you could see, AI-based learning systems studying how you learn mathematics and then make your learning experience so much more granular, adaptive, interactive. Now, you could see the emergence of learning analytics, telling teachers how different students learn differently. Those systems existed before the pandemic, but they were only used very sporadically. And often, the pandemic has increased social acceptance for new solutions, new platforms that we didn't have before. That's, I think, a real transformation. Also before, we invested a lot in training teachers to use technologies with actually quite limited success. And then again, the pandemic, suddenly teachers were ready. In most countries, actually, teachers had showed remarkable skills to actually cope with those kinds of difficulties. So one takeaway from the pandemic is also that actually education systems can change, which is what people often don't believe. In the field of evaluation and assessment, one of the consequences during the pandemic was that many traditional assessment systems that are place-based broke down, and that left, some students in the first year without, the right certificates or with only substitutes for that. But again, also here I would see the pandemic as a game changer. I would say, historically, one of the biggest mistakes that education ever made was to divorce learning from assessment. If you go way back in history, we always saw learning and assessment as two sides of the same coin. We learned through apprenticeship. We learned from people, with people. They always gave us feedback, and suddenly, those things became separated. You pile up years and years and years of learning, and then one day they call you back to do your test or your exam in a very artificial, contrived setting. And that, divorce between learning and assessment has created many of the challenges that we see in education today, making learning more superficial, creating hard pressures, and so on. And again, technology suddenly is reintegrating learning and assessment, giving students, interactive feedback and appraisal, giving teachers, learning analytics. So again, I think the pandemic has been a really good game changer. The third lesson, I would say, is perhaps one that is harder to quantify. But I think the pandemic has shown us that learning is not just a transactional business, but truly a socially relational experience. So the role as teachers, not just as instructors, but as coaches, as mentors, as facilitators, as evaluators, I think it's really come into the center. So in one way, you can say actually the status of the teaching profession has been truly elevated from that. So I think, again, lots of issues. Hybrid learning clearly is there as the new normal, something that we might not have thought before the pandemic. And then last but not least, I would add the ownership over learning. In the past, learning again was quite transactional. Students sit in the classroom, absorb sometimes, prefabricated content, and now students take greater ownership over what they learn and how they learn and where they learn and when they learn. So Singapore was the first country that quite consciously, designed an offline learning experience in the school week, so that students actually take more responsibility to design their own learning, pursue their own learning goals, and so on. So actually, I think lots of really, really interesting experiences that we at the OECD have quite systematically tracked.
That's such a great overview and list. Thanks, Andreas. So really thinking about the impact of the school closures, particularly for disadvantaged students. I heard you talk about the role of technology and hybrid learning and what we could have learned from there, the innovative solutions that came out of how education systems can change during a time of great change, the value of assessments, and really seeing how feedback, what we can learn from assessments, around relationships that we know are so important, the status of the teaching profession, and then as well as student agency during this time. So all great lessons learned. I want to, 3 issues in particular that governors' offices are grappling with right now in big buckets are academic recovery and support, student and staff well-being, and educator recruitment and retention. So I want to just do a little bit of a dive into those 3 issues and what you're seeing across the globe. In terms of academic recovery, what impact did you see from COVID on students learning across the globe, and how are different countries working to effectively address the remaining learning gaps and lost instructional time?
Yeah, again, the most of the differences you can simply explain with the length of school closures. So countries with limited school closures have just seen a very small dip in academic outcomes, sometimes not even. Second, we saw usually a greater dip in secondary education than in primary education because, the home environment was more conducive. Parents have an easier job explaining and helping their primary kids with learning than in secondary schooling. So those were some common pattern. In terms of recovery, what we have perhaps learned is this: just adding time doesn't help much, really. And most of the successful recovery strategies are really about, raising productivity, individual tutoring, new technologies. That's really the kind of personalized approaches. Now, what we also saw is that many students, particularly in countries where schools got closed for long, got socially disconnected from learning. And keep in mind that, often school is not just a place where you learn, but also a very stable place for social development. And it took actually quite a bit of effort in many countries to recuperate those kinds of social and emotional losses. No? But again, you can see many school systems are now back on track, and that shows us really that these issues can be overcome. But it requires targeted efforts. Most kind of universal interventions have been less promising than the kind of targeted interventions that we've seen.
Thank you, really helpful. We've seen a big interest in the tutoring. You mentioned that as a place. How are other countries using sort of their summer or after school time? Do they think about it as sort of separate or as just another place of learning? How do they connect it to the regular school day and as another way to work on this recovery time?
Yeah, again, for some countries, that was not such a difficult experience. They have actually, often school is a very important social space. So there are a lot of opportunities for teachers to engage with students. And I would say that's probably one of the big differentiators to the United States. In the United States, if you're a mathematics teacher, you teach mathematics. If you are a teacher in Japan, in China, in Estonia, you'd spend, a big part of your school day working with students outside the classroom setting. You are also their coach, their mentor. You know not only your field of your discipline, but you actually have a very good knowledge of who your students are, who they want to become, how you can accompany them. And there is sort of scheduled time for that. And then in a pandemic, that is a huge help, because suddenly when the students are not in front of you, you need to understand, how different students learn differently. And so in a way, I think that has helped those systems where you had more social spaces in schools. They could be, it was easier to activate them. Same for communities. Also there, I think those kind of interconnectedness really has been a major asset for countries.
Really helpful. And you're mentioning really knowing students not only academically but holistically, and that's really a core governor focus as well right now of student mental health and well-being. I think it really leads into that. Know that OECD has done this social and emotional skills survey for a number of years. What would you say countries are using to address students' social emotional development particularly well, and how would you say they're doing so?
Perhaps the most important lesson that we have learned from the survey of social emotional skills is that we shouldn't put, academic success and mental well-being at sort of opposing ends of a long spectrum. They're really two sides of the same coin. And in fact, the data show how closely related mental well-being and the academic success of students are. Now, often we have this idea, well, we should make things easier for students and then they will be happier. That's absolutely not what the data show. Actually, the greater expectations the system has for student success and the more support students feel, the better the outcomes on both sides of the spectrum, the academic side and the mental well-being side. What was also really interesting for us to see is that the best predictor for mental health and social emotional outcomes was actually the quality of student-teacher relationships. Again, where students perceive my teacher understands who I am, who I want to become, they support me in my individual learning goals. Those students were happy students, and they were also the high achieving students. So again, putting the quality of relationships first, putting the development of character, of social emotional development on par with academic development. It's the synergies between those two dimensions. One of the concerning findings was that for many students, actually, mental health declines a lot when we measured it at age 10 and age 15. We saw a big dip, particularly for girls. And some say, well, social psychology has explanations for this. When students get older, they become more self-critical, more self-aware, and so. But actually, if that is true, even if that is true, if we know that, shouldn't we design schools more about those learning experiences? And that's something I think we took away from this. So again, the environment that schools build, the expectations they place on students, the support they give, the quality of the relationship, all of those are ones that we should not see as, extraneous factors, but they should be an integral part of the academic development of students. And I think that's really, what for me, and many of these findings were a lot more surprising than the findings from our achievement surveys, because we are just much less aware of those. On mathematics and science, we have lots of data sources. We keep them on the radar screen. But on the social emotional development, and it's not just, mental health. You can also look at, curiosity. You can look at persistence. You can look at, self-concept, to what extent, self-efficacy, to what extent emotional resilience. And you can see pretty much the same picture for all of that, where students feel well in themselves, where there is an environment that is, productive, a disciplined classroom climate, actually all of those outcomes, including the academic ones, tend to be strong. There is a lot, that school can do to shape those social and emotional outcomes in addition to the academic ones. We often think, well, it's to do with, family and friends, and of course that's true. But actually, there are many levers through which school can actually positively influence the well-being of students.
That's great to hear. And I like the way you're framing it, and it makes so much sense of always think about the interrelationship between the academics and the well-being, the mental health, the holistic needs of students. They're, as you said, two sides of the same coin, and to be thinking about that interrelationship at all times. Another interrelated area, all of these are, is certainly educator recruitment and retention. I know you've written a number of years around teacher professionalism. What can governors and states learn from other countries on key strategies for strengthening their educator recruitment and retention systems?
Yeah, again, the first lesson for me would be to offer people interesting careers. Now, the attractiveness of the profession is not mainly determined by pay levels, at least not when you look at this internationally. It's usually determined that the profession is intellectually attractive, that it offers people interesting, diverse careers, that it rewards excellence in performance, and that it has differentiated pathways. If you go to a country like Singapore that is doing really well on that, the first day you become a teacher in a school, your school principal will ask you, what do you want to do in your life? You want to go into management? You want to go into leadership? You want to go into, pedagogy? And then from then on, you're going to continue to work on your career. Most teachers there, while they teach, would continue to study, to develop, themselves. And I think that's a really big driver of teacher professionalism. Second, we see the combination of a high degree of professional autonomy and a collaborative culture is really, really key. That teachers are, creative designers of innovative learning environments, that they work, with a high degree of confidence and trust from their societies, but also making contributions to the profession. Again, I think there's a lot that we can learn from Asian education systems, where basically you take it for granted. If every week you would do your model lessons and you can post them on a digital platform, and actually the more other teachers will download your lessons, criticize them, use them, improve them, the more you get recognized in the profession. And at the end of the school year, your school principal will not just ask you what's the achievement score of your students in the class, but what contribution did you make to the profession? How have you shaped the lives and careers of other teachers? How you have mentored them? So that collaborative culture, high degree of professional autonomy, that combination, I would put, as a second dimension of success. And again, it shows us that public policy can actually do a lot other than through financial means to shape the attractiveness of the profession. And that also ultimately determines the social status. We see across countries huge differences in the social status that teachers have. And you can ask yourself, is the social status an input or is it an outcome? And I would actually say from our analysis, it's very much a design feature of the education system.
Yeah, really thinking beyond compensation. And as you said, the societal support, the social status, as you said, of what the profession is viewed as, that in itself is an attractiveness driver. And then, you mentioned professional autonomy, collaborative culture, so as other important factors, and appreciate you doing so. Always like to end on an optimistic note in particular. So as you look ahead, where do you see your work headed next? What are you most excited about?
Well, these days, I think artificial intelligence pushes us to think harder about what makes us human. We've seen that the kind of things that are easiest to teach and test are precisely the things that are easiest to digitize. And I do think that creates a kind of healthy, environment for education to reinvent itself, to look anew at the purposes of education. What is going to make young people successful in their future, not just our past. So we do a lot of research anticipating the evolution of skill demand and then thinking through what implications could that have, for curriculum design, curriculum development, instructional policy, teacher education, and so on. So that's, one strand that actually I think is absolutely fascinating. And the second part is also to do with technology. How do we use technology just, to enable new types of pedagogies, new kind of learning experiences, and making learning more personal, more interactive, more granular, more participative? Why would you listen to a teacher explaining to you the results of a scientific experiment when you can do that yourself in a virtual laboratory these days? Now, I also think, teachers who become, data scientists can actually now study how different students learn differently and then, embrace that diversity with much more differentiated pedagogical practice. Now, seeing again how their, work gets transformed from just being an instructor to becoming really a good, coach, a good mentor, and all of that. So that second part of how do you use technology in education is equally exciting. And if you put the two together, that's the future of education.
Wow, that's a great way to end our conversation, really. But harnessing technology for the impact on the future of education, the future of learning, and the future of work, very much as you've encapsulated. So, well, thanks, Andreas, for a great conversation, and thank you for sharing your expertise, your insights today. Viewers, please note that all the reports and resources that we've discussed today during this webinar will be attached to the recording once it's posted to the NGA website. But thanks, Andreas, again, and until next time, thanks for joining us, and have a great day.